Good morning and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. As always, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. Joining me today is freelance journalist Michael Friedrich to talk about some of his recent work in the Prospect on something that seems really historic to me and that I haven't heard of before. Is this the first rent debt strike in U.S. history?
That is right. According to the strikers and the Debt Collective, the organization that's organizing them, this is the first known rent debt strike in U.S. history.
Well, it's nice to be able to it's nice to be able to talk about a first that's good news for a change.
Yeah, that's right. So the news is that there are 9 former tenants of a giant landlord called Equity Residential, which is the 5th largest landlord in the country. And they all have varying amounts of rent debt, have been evicted or moved out of their apartment over the last few years. And they are going on strike. They're organizing together to refuse to pay back their rent debt to this giant landlord who they say has been guilty of all kinds of misconduct and abuse.
I want to clarify that and make sure I understood it right. So these are people who have been evicted and the former landlord is still trying to collect rent from them. Is that accurate?
That's right. So this is a pretty common situation that I think most Americans maybe don't think of or are not aware of. But a lot of people have debt to former landlords. They've been evicted, they've had some kind of court settlement, they've done a move out deal, and the landlord is still trying to collect back rent debt from them.
I imagine even in some situations, their landlord hits them with a big move out bill that they had no idea they were going to see coming too.
There may be some of that. What I heard more is accumulated late fees, legal fees, all kinds of other, the claim of the tenants and the reason they say that their debt is uncollectible legally is that the landlord has inflated their bills in various ways. So either with illegal late fees or inflated utility bills through this unusual utility billing scheme that the landlord and many landlords in California use. This is in Los Angeles.
Now,
and a variety of other ways
I'm
that they
curious about the illegal late fees term, because now I'm wondering how many of the late fees that my landlord charges me are legal and which ones are illegal.
It varies state to state. According to a tenant attorney I spoke to in Los Angeles, late fees in general are basically illegal across the state of California. That's not the case in every state, but it doesn't stop landlords often from attaching them, even if it's under a different term.
I'm pretty sure that every corporate landlord agreement I've ever seen includes not just late fees, but very harsh and arbitrary late fees if you cannot pay your rent before the 5th of every month, which is a very tricky thing to demand when people don't necessarily always get paid their paycheck on the 1st of every month.
Yeah, that's certainly true. The tenants I spoke to for this article also say that the landlord used a system that wouldn't allow them to do partial payments. So a lot of people really wanted to pay their rent even as much as they could pay in good faith, but the landlord's system basically bars them from doing this and pushes them towards accumulating debt and eviction.
We can only accept your full rent. We can't accept any lower. I've had a landlord try that on me too.
And there's other ways that they attach fees. A big grievance of the tenants in Los Angeles, and in fact, organizing with the same people, the Debt Collective and the Los Angeles Tenants Union, there are a couple of buildings that are currently on strike against the same landlord, Equity Residential, because they use this opaque utility billing practice.
Yes.
It's called RUBS, Ratio Utility Billing Systems. Instead of paying your individual metered fee for utilities, you pay this kind of aggregated, pooled, divided fee.
Yes.
And the thing about it is that it lets the landlord, the tenants allege, attach other fees that are not necessarily legal to their utility bills.
Well, because
there's a third-party billing entity that's charging them a fee to pay their utility bills. So it's like very abusive practices when you really
we have a thing where we can pay our rent online, but to pay our rent online, we have to go through a third-party billing service that charges us to pay our rent online with our debit card.
I've been looking more into this because it's extremely common, especially with these large institutional landlords.
And one of our former landlords, like I had said, specifically did that to us where they didn't want to take a partial payment. And I said, look, your own paperwork says legally that the only thing I'm bound to give you at this point is the back rent. And that if I give you the back rent, not counting utilities and late fees, you have to take it and you can't throw me out. And the landlord was like, oh, you're right, and took the payment. But if I hadn't known that, I would have been out of luck.
Absolutely. And I think, tenants have varying amounts of savvy and ability to make the case for themselves in these situations, especially the very powerful landlord that also is vertically integrated with the property manager and is playing hardball. Often, Brett Christophers writes about this. He writes a lot about these large institutional landlords that are basically asset managers.
Yes.
And it's junk fees, it's hair trigger evictions. A lot of them are going to just instantly file an eviction on you if you're
my day-to-day landlord is a property manager for a company called Norris & Stevens. Norris & Stevens is itself a property management company that essentially exists to collect rent for properties that are owned by rich kids' trust funds.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so that gets into a little bit of the background on this particular landlord and type of landlord. Equity Residential is what's known as a real estate investment trust, which is probably what you're talking about. There are different types of investment firms that act as landlords. But, Equity is a publicly traded company. It's responsible to shareholders, and it's basically investing shareholder money in property as assets and in the money markets. So it's highly financialized, which, that's also something Brett Christophers, the author, talks about, is this increasing financialization of all sectors of our lives. So we have this landlord, and the tenants and organizers say, essentially, this is a firm it's more of an investment company. It's not a landlord that's committed to providing livable, affordable, good quality housing for people to live in Los Angeles. And Equity owns properties all across the country in basically every major metropolitan area. What it really is a firm that's profit maximizing and cutting costs as much as possible. Often that means cutting maintenance, refusing to maintain the warrant of habitability if it can get away with it, and creating pretty miserable conditions for tenants, because ultimately they're trying to maximize profits by cutting corners and increase the bottom line for their shareholders.
And which, of course, they've been told to do since the 1970s by economists who say that it's an ethical mandate on corporate CEOs to maximize shareholder profits this quarter. And nothing else matters as much as maximizing profits for shareholders this quarter.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So, I report on these things because I think that if there's a big message of what I do, whether it's reported or an essay or opinion piece, is that we can't, as a country and as a people, rely on these profit maximizing firms to deliver goods, especially something as essential as housing that's good quality and that serves people's needs, and particularly people at the lowest incomes and at the bottom of society.
And when I hear the word equity these days, obviously this is word association to public equity, which isn't directly involved, but the word association with equity these days isn't great because it makes us immediately think of the guy who robbed Kmart.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, I know it immediately has the resonance of private equity. This is not a private equity firm.
No.
Different kind of investor and asset manager, however.
Yes.
So in some ways has similar goals.
I found to go back to the business models that because the real estate the real estate investment trust is one of those tools that actually is used by people's financial managers to protect them from having to pay taxes the same way they would have to pay on income, and instead paying a different set of rules for taxes on property, while at the same time really maximizing rents for the rich kids who own the properties through these trust funds.
Yeah, absolutely. And they, it is you call it a tax shelter. I mean, it's an investment asset. And that's true too. They're maxing out rents. There are major rent increases. I guess if it's interesting to go into a little bit of backstory we can talk more about the organizing, which I think is the good news.
The organizing is the good news, definitely.
It's nice to lay out the case against this landlord and this type of landlord as a kind of setup. But the story I wrote about the organizing, the strike, is a follow-up to a story I wrote back in the spring. There's a piece of research that came out by a UCLA researcher and tenant organizer named Alexander Ferrer. And he was using this organizing tool, which helped people, the Debt Collective created this tool to help people respond to eviction filings. And what he did is took the data from that tool to look at the patterns of eviction by landlord. So see what landlords' eviction behaviors were, and especially how they related to the race of tenants. And what he found is that these corporate REITs, real estate investment trusts, in Los Angeles, where the data is located, evicted Black tenants at a vastly higher rate than individual landlords do, and at a vastly higher rate than would be expected in those areas where they were filing the evictions. So like 3 times higher rate than the Black population in the areas where they were doing evictions. So you already have this picture, and I reported on this, you already have this picture of these bad actors, especially in the pandemic. They seemed to be luring kind of lower income, less qualified tenants into these more upmarket properties, extracting rent from them, and then being willing to just churn through tenants, evicting them very quickly if they didn't keep up. And doing this to poor people and to Black people especially. And in that study, there were 3 big landlords that stood out, and all of them were REITs, and Equity Residential was the worst offender. So this study and this data is part of how the organizers decided what landlord to target for an action. That's how they picked equity residential. There were a lot of grievances, like we're talking about, against.
They found the most deserving target.
That's right. That's right.
I love it.
Very deserving one.
I like that process. I like that process. That's perfect.
It's data driven, as the nonprofits like to say. Yeah.
I like it when data driven turns out to actually mean something instead of just be some weird advertising slogan.
I absolutely agree. So it's good to see them. I thought that was a worthwhile story to cover. Nobody else really covered this study, I think, until more recently with the strike. But it was really interesting to see them use the data for organizing. And in that story, I teased the strike wasn't public yet, but I teased the idea that it could be used for this purpose of a rent debt action.
Yeah, I love it. I think it's important that I think it's a good baseline rule that you don't pay a landlord anything after he evicts you.
I think so too, and it's harder.
I know. Oh, I know.
You know, I guess if we talk a bit, and if you want to talk a bit about the strike itself and the kind of logic and legal strategy behind it, that's part of it. So just by way of background, the Debt Collective, a lot of people might be familiar with their work because they've been around since the Occupy Wall Street movement. They came out of that movement. And their big cause was student debt. And they made a lot of waves about 10 years ago because they organized a small group of defrauded student borrowers who had been students enrolled at Corinthian universities or Corinthian colleges, one of these degree mills whose degrees turn out to be not worth the paper they're printed on.
Quote unquote nursing schools that and medical assistant schools that weren't actually making people qualified.
Yeah, that's a great clear description of it. So they organized about 15 tenants, I think it was 15, the Corinthian 15, to go on debt strike against their student debt. And they did something similar. They created this online tool where any student could come and dispute their debt through this portal. And they attracted tens of thousands of defrauded student borrowers from Corinthian colleges, the art institutes, ITT, all these degree mills. And they actually won from the federal government broad-based debt relief. For Corinthian, it was like $5 billion odd for tens of thousands of borrowers. And that eventually expanded to these other institutions as well. The federal government discharged their debt. So it was a huge win that started with this group of 15 borrowers.
And that's great news. And I don't know that everybody necessarily heard that the student debt strikers won at that point when it happened. I think this is probably news to a lot of people who are hearing it for the first time.
I didn't, frankly, remember all the details until I went back and read into it as I was researching this story. And it is amazing news. What's amazing, I think, especially, is you start with this this moral claim by this small group of borrowers: we can't pay, we won't pay. And that's kind of what I wanted to get at. You know, the people who were defrauded by these institutions, these schools, they couldn't get employment in the field they were studying, and they couldn't make the money to pay back the debt. So they said, we can't pay, we won't pay. In this case, with these former tenants, they're making a similar claim, which is, you know, you abused us when we were your tenants, you ran up our bills, and we can't pay, so we're not going to pay. These people are not paying on their debts to begin with. They may have, you know, the landlord's collectors coming after them. But they're not in a position to pay, and morally, they have a claim that they ought not to pay. And so they're refusing on those grounds. And there's a similar online legal tool that will help anybody go online and dispute their debt with a landlord and report their landlord. So they're hoping to bring, tens of thousands of other rent debtors into the strike, starting with this core group of 9 for equity residential, but also for other corporate landlords and REITs with similar practices. And I mean, I guess I can stop there, but I can answer more questions about that.
But no, it's just I'm just listening because it's just such amazing news, and I should talk more, which is usually not my problem. I think it's really important that when we're talking about rent debt, we understand right off the bat, if somebody isn't homeless, they're paying rent somewhere else actively in order to maintain their current home.
Yeah.
And it seems like a former landlord who has thrown someone out trying to capture debts after the fact is just ultimately one more barrier to people actually having a safe, reliable place to live.
Absolutely. And when you think about the consequences of eviction and debt, it's that your credit score becomes ruined.
You don't just magically find another place to live. Usually it's harder to get into another place after you've been evicted from one, after all.
And people who have an eviction on their record or who have a completely damaged credit score go to try to find a traditional rental apartment, and they can't. They're rejected. The couple I spoke to who had about $50,000 in debt, they had been withholding payment for a variety of reasons. They ended up settling with the landlord, doing a move-out agreement. They ended up with an eviction on their record, and they ended up with all the credit consequences. And what they found is that they can't get accepted for a traditional lease in an apartment. And then meanwhile, they would go to Airbnb because they needed short-term housing, and they would be able to stay in the same apartment, same apartment complex for much more money. So you think about that, that adage, it's expensive to be poor. This is a great example of it.
Airbnb renting out the same apartments in the same complex just seems like that feeds back into other scandals in the rental industry, like RealPage helping property managers maximize making money off their vacant units.
Sure, that's a rabbit hole, but so it's absolutely true. There are all these platforms and softwares that are helping landlords.
I work for a company.
We're going to make money.
I've always found I find the RealPage scandal fascinating because I work in an electrical industry, and one of the things that the company I work for makes is electrical submeters. So I talk to landlords or people who work for Conservice or RealPage or something like that more often than I would really want to. And it's just fascinating how. So the state has rules about how you can and can't bill people for utilities, which makes the whole ratio billing scheme so useful to landlords, because the state says you can't charge someone for this, you can charge someone for this, and you can only charge someone for this under X sets of circumstances. But these ratio billing services are just saying, well, we're just charging everybody their fair share of the total usage for the property. But we only have the landlord's word that it's really everybody's fair share.
That's right.
They actually have to send us and we have to go through it if we want to know if it's really our fair share. They have to send us now all the usage numbers for the electricity and water in our place because of the way they bill us.
And I'll tell you that these institutional landlords they're very reluctant to share the transparent, itemized utility bills. That's what these tenants have found, to my understanding. Well, I'll say too, RealPage, you brought it up, it figures into this story. So there's this moral claim that we're talking about that the tenants have, that their debt should be uncollectible. Yes. But they also have a legal claim because of the use of RUBS, because of potentially unlawful late fees, contracts that are not totally transparent or not totally honest. In other words, leases that promise things that aren't in the complex, violations of habitability, all of this kind of stuff. They say that the landlords are violating consumer protection laws. And what they really want is for FTC regulators or the state analogs of the FTC and state attorneys general to take action against these landlords. And that's not out of the question. This kind of stuff has happened against other big landlords like Invitation Homes. In fact, Kamala Harris, when she was Attorney General of California, is the one who brought suit against Corinthian colleges in California.
Yes.
If I remember correctly.
Yes.
So it's been done in these situations. And there's also potential for private litigation for former tenants as a class if they have been defrauded. But to bring it back to RealPage, Equity Residential is named in the class action that was just settled.
Of course.
They're using it. And they just were part of the group of landlords, I believe, that settled, if I'm not mistaken, in the last week. And that may also strengthen tenants' case that there was anti-competitive practices going on.
Well, I have a serious ethical question about a vacant unit at a residential complex someone was evicted from being available on some of these bed and breakfast apps. I mean, that's just a little bit suspicious. We're not actually offering it for rent. We're using it as a way to generate quicker income.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I don't know all the details of that. It may have been that
it may be a sublet situation for all I know, but
for sure,
still weird.
I think it more speaks to the situation of those former tenants who
of course definitely
and ended up paying more money than they would in rent on a legitimate lease. I'll say, just in terms of the life consequences for people, that couple lives in a car. They had money, and they're both employed. One is disabled and has disability insurance checks. The other works security. They have good income, but they can't find a place, and they live in a car that they can fit a bed in, which is more and more common in California.
And they've been trying to pass laws to harass people who have to live in their cars in California too.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And of course, Gavin Newsom has been trying to set himself up as even tougher on homelessness than the new mayor of San Francisco. So
that's right, Gavin Newsom, the progressive who wants to eject all homeless from California.
The progressive who wants to eject all homeless from California and who just absolutely hates the idea of single payer healthcare in California. He's gone through more schemes and scams to avoid keeping promises on that than. It's just shocking. I mean, I'm amazed. I understand that our system doesn't give people choices, and people feel like, well, our only choices are Democrats or Republicans. But at the same time, it's shocking that the lack of alternatives manages to hold up for so long. And I don't know what it's going to take anymore. I think we're at the point where things like strike actions, whether it's debt strikes, rent strikes, not going to work. I mean, I think we've really reached the point where those kinds of actions are the only thing that are going to really make anyone listen to us.
Well, I do too. And I think it's because we have a ruling class that is dictated by profit. And, I think you look at the action yesterday. We're speaking on Sunday morning. Yesterday was the so-called No Kings protest.
Yes.
And I think there is value at getting huge masses of people out.
I think there is.
Whether or not there are clear demands, it's some demonstration of numbers and force and popular will. And I see a lot of people, in the discourse saying it needs to be followed up with a general strike. And I've heard a lot about murmurs about a general strike over the last few years. That's a massive operation.
It is
I'm
a massive operation.
Not a labor reporter. I don't want to speak out of turn about the realities of striking, labor organizing, or a general strike. But at the time in this country when we had things like general strikes, we had a much stronger labor
that's relatively speaking. It's true, but the actual high point of labor action was at what would now be considered the weak point of the union movement. The quote unquote strong point of the union movement just after World War II was one of constant retrenchment and accommodation to state power, to strike in ways that won't make the government mad, to follow the rules, to protect the interests of the industry in a balanced way, as opposed to the interests of the workers, because we want all our people to still have jobs. And they can't have jobs if we drive the employers out of business.
In other words, it was not a non-militant moment.
Yes, it reached the point where the so-called highest strength moment of the labor union became the labor movement. Became the moment where the labor movement stopped doing much except politically supporting liberal Democrats for office. And then when they started trying to do things again in the 70s, they were copying strategies that worked for the civil rights movement in a completely different frame of context than the labor movement. Nonviolent sit-ins are not necessarily the best way for the mine workers to address their conditions. They need to not go to work. And ceremonially taking over a mining company's offices while your actual miners are still in the mines digging coal isn't necessarily an effective labor action. And so a lot of obviously this is my opinion, and I'm not trying to tell anybody else to say anything that would get them in trouble, and people are welcome to argue with me. But you see a lot of the so-called strength of the 1950s and the 1960s wasted away in the 1970s as guys like Joe Biden, who's still my favorite name to choose for this list. He's the second guy. The first guy is Thomas Eagleton, who's really to blame for much of this, and who co-signed the resegregation of schools with Joe Biden. But all these white Democrats from liberal states who are suddenly running against the civil rights movement in the 1970s. Joe Biden is the best example because when he was a county supervisor, he's talking about moving affordable housing to the suburbs. And then as senator, he's co-signing an amendment to stop forced busing. And at the same time, he's the working class labor union guy, allegedly. But and then he
more so than a lot of recent executives.
No, it's interesting though that when you actually look, well, who are the working class unions that support Biden? Well, it turns out it's the firefighters and the cops. And then, firefighters are sort of working class, but they're still reasonably well-off government employees compared to a lot of folks. And then cops, that raises a whole other question about unions that AFL failed to address before Richard Trumka died a few years ago. And so, yeah, we need a general strike. The labor movement is probably not going to be delivering a general strike anytime soon. Sarah Nelson made noises about a general strike if Trump won in 2020. But nobody in the labor movement was ready for Trump winning in 2024. They seemed to think that was just an impossibility that they didn't need to be prepared for.
Yeah, and I think in the scheme of things, getting into the broader political picture and the kind of actions people can take, I like this. I was excited by this strike action.
Yes.
Because it's everybody I've ever talked to who organizes and the groups I've organized with, the idea is you have to work with people where they are.
Yes.
If you're a tenant, you have shared interests with people first and foremost in your own building. You start a tenants association. And the idea of the thing that's novel in some ways about this debt strike is that it's very hard to know anything about people who've been evicted.
Yeah.
Because they're not part of a tenants association anymore. They're not in the building anymore. How do you find them? Let alone how do you organize them? So it's really interesting putting together a group of people who have the shared interest of having debt, unjust debt,
yes,
with a particular landlord, and organizing on that basis. That's their material interest.
Yes, it is.
And then the other thing that's really novel that the folks at the Debt Collective and the Los Angeles Tenants Union will point out is that they're connecting these former tenants, these debtors, with current tenants of equity residential. They're combining their power and they're finding their shared interests because, the abuses that current tenants are facing with RUBS and bad habitability conditions, these debtors faced them too. And so there's a way of delivering on both fronts. They have the striking buildings in LA over the utility billing system, and they also have the debt strike. And the name of the game is power. And that's what the tenants I spoke to said. They said, we're more than one voice. This gives us power.
Well, and you have to be able to organize smaller actions to organize bigger actions. Things like this network people together and build an organization like the Debt Collective up so it can do more.
That seems right to me. Yeah, and to everything I know about organizing.
And any sort of goal of reaching a general strike, in my opinion, involves two things that come first, and then a third, which is the actual strike itself. But first, you have to network people together in the first place and have a way of providing for their needs during a strike action. So that's mutual aid and smaller actions like this. And then it's the second thing is you have to have some sort of infrastructure to protect people who are striking from the violence that will inevitably be used against them by their bosses who want them to come back to work. And that's a second piece of organizing. And the actual strike itself sort of comes out of that. And you can't skip to the end. You have to do everything possible to build tension towards that general strike. And
I'm not a theorist, no. Labor organizing, or much of a practitioner.
I'm a generalist. I think a little bit about everything.
I organize with a freelance journalists union.
Yes.
That is national, and I know people here in New York City who are involved, but it's hard to build power. And that is my perspective. We have to start with shared interests before we put them together with everybody's shared interests to do something like a huge mass national action.
We have to be able to build power, and building power means sometimes starting small and then connecting things through, I hate to sound metaphysical, webs of shared interest. You have to be, way back in the day, sociologists used to actually talk about what they called the collective unconscious, which is all the things we agree on without really thinking about them. And you have to reach a certain point in the collective unconscious where we need to do something is something broadly shared before you can get to that general strike point.
Yeah, and I mean, to really be metaphysical about it, I think you see an action like we saw yesterday with just hundreds of thousands of people in the streets across every city and little towns. You know, my dad and my stepmother were out in the tiniest town in exurban rural Maryland, and there was a No Kings protest there. I think that's an expression in the way you're talking about of a collective unconscious.
Yes.
The problem is it now needs an object, a shared object.
Something like the No Kings movement needs to be, something like the indivisible movement needs to be tethered to a theory of power other than, well, let's get a bunch of people to vote the right way in a midterm election. Right. Now, I will say that I believe that indivisible and even more the George Floyd protests defeated Donald Trump. If you have enough protests going on during an election season in the way that we did in 2020, it was impossible for Donald Trump to win under those circumstances. And it looked like we were seeing certain changes in which states were willing to be Republican and which states weren't willing to be Republican because of Donald Trump. And then we saw a Democratic Party, regardless of who you want to blame, we saw a Democratic Party that wanted to completely fritter away every advantage that they had won in the 2020 elections by fighting among themselves and proving once again that Democrats' worst enemy is their inability to compromise with their own conservatives successfully, let alone trying to be bipartisan with Republicans. They can't even muster their own public opinion to keep conservatives out of power in their own party.
Sure. But I think, the countervailing example is that you can take this collective desire expressed through some of these mass actions and channel it or find expression in it through an elected figure.
Yes.
Like you see this obviously right now in New York City with Zoran Mamdani, who, he's giving language to that desire in materialist terms. Here are these very clear affordability goals.
I want Zoran to win, and I want to see what it is actually possible from a mayor of New York. I don't know how optimistic I am. I think he's going to win. I don't think that's even a question anymore. But the real problem is what are the institutional challenges in New York for an anti-machine mayor? Bill de Blasio's time as mayor is generally not considered overwhelmingly successful by his supporters. And that's the best we've had in a while.
That's right. Yeah, I'm curious too how he'll be able to govern, what he'll be able to uphold, from his policy platform. It does seem clear that he'll win. I guess I'm talking more about this exact moment, the expression.
Yes.
How it works out in reality remains to be seen.
And really, when we're talking about the material end of it, how it works out in reality tells us what our options are as far as on putting all our eggs into the election basket.
Yeah. Yep.
I think that we're reaching the point where it's unrealistic for us to rely on politicians to save us anymore. And the lesson from Marvel Comics movies isn't that we need to be saved by someone else, but that, Captain America was a dude who had to go punch Hitler himself. I think it's tremendously worth noting that the year that Timely Comics put Captain America on the cover punching Hitler in the mouth, the blonde kid from Brooklyn was chosen to be Captain America, and Brooklyn was the headquarters of the Communist Party USA in the middle of the Popular Front. And so we're making a statement about who's willing to punch Hitler in the mouth. And, some of that's Jack Kirby himself has said, the only politics I was thinking about at the time is someone needs to punch Hitler in the mouth. Yeah. And I think we're at the point where we need to start thinking about how we can punch the landlord and the boss in the mouth. Not literally, of course. I'm not advocating for violence, folks.
I think that's a more proximate goal. I didn't mean to take us down an electoral path. I am curious. I'm more saying that we have found some expression in this single figure here in New York, to some degree, nationally. But as you say, it might be better expressed through these really proximate political actions where we take power and show that we can wield power as a collective.
And I think tenant organizing, whether both around debt and about the rent itself, and for that matter about maintenance and all these hidden fees and whether or not people are being honest about the utilities, I think, all that organizing is every bit as important as workplace organizing. I rent. My rent is the biggest part of my expenses. I know it's worse for people in even more expensive places to live than the Pacific Northwest. It's ridiculous in San Francisco and Los Angeles and New York. They have more empty homes in most of the big cities of this country than they have homeless people in those same cities. We could be housing everyone right now, and we're choosing not to because it makes people more money for there to be homeless people. If it's, and at the same time, we have this massive political movement. Well, we just need to build more housing, build more housing, build more housing, without any thought for the environmental consequences. In fact, they want to deregulate to make the environmental consequences worse. I'm sorry, now I'm getting off on my anti-YIMBY run.
No, I mean, you're talking to the right guy. I don't know how much you've read of my past work, but if I'm known for anything, you know, as a relatively low profile journalist, I'm known for having written at the New Republic against YIMBYism. And I live in Brooklyn, in Brownstone, Brooklyn.
Yes.
I don't know if I've said that yet in this show, but this is where I'm based, and I live in what would be considered naturally occurring affordable housing.
Yeah.
I have an under-market 1-bedroom apartment with my wife, and it's owned by a small landlord who I think only owns this one building. But that's a nice situation. And
we were waiting for a place like that at one point. We may still be on the waiting list. I don't know, but nobody could get into it because the landlord only owns the one building and nobody ever moves out because the tenants are happy.
Yeah, that's right. And I think about this, you know, if my wife and I have a kid or get pushed out by the landlord for whatever reason, you know, she decides she wants to move back into the building, which is totally possible. It's a pretty harsh market out there. And I've lived in New York, in Brooklyn, mostly since 2000. In a lot of ways, the reason, well, first of all, I think anybody who lives in New York thinks about real estate and housing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any conversation you have with a stranger who you've just met tends toward housing and real estate. So I think we're all kind of trained to think about this. But even in 2000, I moved into this famous loft, artist's loft building in Bushwick. And I was 18 years old. I could see then that I was part of this historic shift happening. You know, it started long before me, but I was in the middle of being, you know, a white kid from the suburbs moving into a black and brown neighborhood, and you know, the neighborhood changing to be more residential and accommodate more people like me coming in and moving into what was formerly low-cost housing. You know, there are warehoused apartments and there are vacant apartments that landlords are holding vacant, but I'm not a vacancy truther, as the YIMBY folks say.
Sure.
There is a lack of affordable housing.
There is a lack of affordable housing. Yes, this is a really important. It's not the vacancies. The truth about vacancy is important because it shows the business model. The question, it's not, well, we could just house all the homeless people and tomorrow, and we should, which is true, but it's kind of simplistic. It doesn't address the whole issue. But at the same time, the reason for all these vacancies is because it is profitable to create these vacancies. And the lie that the YIMBY movement tells is that if we just build more, that these vacancies will magically fill in.
That's certainly part of it.
There is affordable housing here in the Portland area has a 5-year lifespan. I announced that I want to build an apartment complex, and then I decide I want the federal government to subsidize my profits. So I announced that it will be an affordable complex that meets the federal government's requirements for an affordable complex. And for 5 years, I get subsidized so that I make more money charging less rent than if I were actually competing as a market landlord. Now, when that 5 years ends, I immediately raise the rent on all my tenants.
5 years is by the city or the state?
5 years is how the state of Oregon and or the federal government in this area do it. I'm not 100% sure which, but I believe it's at least partly federally, and it might even be both federal and state subsidies mixed together for all I know.
Most affordable complexes are, the most common one is what's called LIHTC, low income housing tax credit. It's a tax credit system of subsidizing affordable housing construction. That lasts a minimum of 30 years if the landlord doesn't squirm out of it. But it's true that
no, it's the most common subsidy here is about a 5-year cap. I wish I could say 30 years was normal.
Yeah. But my perspective is basically, I mean, we don't have to get all the way down this rabbit hole, although I'm usually happy to.
I love this rabbit hole myself, but that's a whole nother topic too.
But for a variety of reasons, I don't think that streamlining, deregulation, liberalizing zoning is going to get us meaningful reductions in rent. Most of what it gets us is slower rent increases, is what the data shows. Small reductions in rent increases, and it doesn't meet the moment, And even if we did like YIMBY maximalism, I don't think it would result in the kind of building the most bullish and hopeful YIMBYs think it would.
I'm going to steal some phrasing from a progressive linguist, one of whose associates is now an anti-YIMBY activist. But there is no such thing as a free market. There are liberal markets. Liberal markets are regulated either by government actors or by the people, or by the largest sellers in the market. When we talk about a free market, we are not actually talking about the lack of regulation versus regulation. We are talking about whether the market shall be regulated by democratic government or by corporate government. And right now, the so-called free market is regulated by corporate government, and any sort of deregulation of democratic power over that corporate government just makes that corporate government stronger and more predatory. Mm-hmm. And the YIMBYs are advocating for more corporate government in the housing market and not less.
Yeah, that's right. They want to let the market rip. And what it really means is they want to let corporate actors, corporate landlords rip.
When they say we want to keep driving up the price of tulips so that we can make money when the price of tulips falls again.
Exactly. Well, right.
and housing shouldn't be tulips.
And the misconception is that that developers, who are often the same entities as landlords,
yes,
are going to build their way into a historic decrease in housing prices and rents.
Yeah, the YIMBY movement wants you to believe that the developer and the landlord have competing interests when they are often exactly the same person.
Right. Do your listeners know? I've got to assume your viewers and listeners know what YIMBYism is.
I hope so, but it's always a good idea to give a basic explanation of the fake "yes in my backyard" movement
to orient the listener,
especially since the term NIMBY in its modern construction was invented by Jack Kemp to shame liberals.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, the pamphlet "Not in My Backyard" was the first publication of the YIMBY movement put out by Jack Kemp's HUD department when Poppy Bush was president.
I appreciate the gloss you've been giving to that intellectual history of YIMBYism on your channel. It's useful to understand the sort of philosophical underpinnings.
Yeah, John C. Calhoun believes that our society will be more orderly if we don't abolish slavery. And that's where YIMBYism comes from.
I think a lot of self-styled progressives who have attached themselves to the YIMBY movement and just want us or developers to be able to build more apartments would strenuously disagree with that, or at least don't identify with that at all. And in fairness to YIMBYs, so to orient a listener who may or may not know what YIMBYism is, now that we've been talking about it for 10, 15 minutes, YIMBY stands for "Yes in My Backyard." YIMBYs are people who want to liberalize the market, to deregulate zoning especially, but also permitting processes and all this red tape that gets in the way of developers building more apartments. And their particular target is single-family zoning, which in a lot of ways has a racist and exclusionary legacy in the suburbs to keep Black and brown and other undesirable groups out of the suburbs and keep them white. And so YIMBYism launched in San Francisco. Was launched by a woman named Sonia Traus.
Well, if you want to be really fair or unfair, depending on how you prefer to do it, you really can put the origin of YIMBYism in San Francisco in context with the careers of Dianne Feinstein and Dan White. I mentioned Dan White specifically for a reason. If anybody knows who Dan White is, he shot Harvey Milk with Dianne Feinstein's gun. That last part doesn't get mentioned enough. It was Dianne Feinstein's gun.
So you're starting there. I'll tell you, the traditional story of YIMBYism doesn't go back as far as the kind of intellectual history you've been giving, and that the Show Your Work channel has been giving on YouTube, which is really useful to understand the kind of
economic thinking is the best way to put it. It's the actual political economy as worked on by James Buchanan and the many quote liberal / libertarian / progressive think tanks funded by people who range from Chucky Koch to Gary Tan.
Yeah, essentially a libertarian view of political economy that seeks to deregulate.
Just a lot of people they were progressive while Barack Obama was president, though.
Sure. Anyway, YIMBYism, to the extent that it began in San Francisco as a concrete movement or organization, Sonia Traus started an organization called Bay Area Renters Federation, and was lobbying to create more liberal zoning laws, to make it possible to build apartments, taller buildings of apartments in San Francisco. The idea being that there's a lot of people, tech workers especially, who need to move into San Francisco, and the rents are too high. And if we build more buildings, there'll be more supply. It'll meet this exploding demand, and housing prices will come down. A very economics 101 conception of how to get prices down. They were massively funded by the tech industry and the real estate industry. And now they're branded as Yes in My Backyard, YIMBY, as opposed to Not in My Backyard, which is traditionally associated with suburban homeowners. But the interesting discursive turn of YIMBYism in San Francisco is that not just suburban homeowners in wealthy areas, but anybody who opposed new luxury condo buildings that the YIMBYs supported in San Francisco became a NIMBY. Yes. And that included poor residents of Chinatown, residents of poor Black neighborhoods who said, whenever condos come into this neighborhood, it means gentrification is starting. We don't want that. This
was the core political conflict between the Moscone milk progressives and the Feinstein white conservatives in San Francisco. There was the quote pro-growth faction and the quote community character faction. Milk and Moscone wanted to put a lot of public money back into education and community services in minority and gay neighborhoods for very good progressive reasons. And the pro-growth faction wanted all municipal spending to be on the cops, the fire department, and tax breaks for developers building office buildings, because they wanted to make lots of money in rent on office buildings. And as a result of their policy, San Francisco now has office buildings they can't keep full that are losing massive amounts of money. And we're now seeing a political movement to do the same thing with residential construction that they did with office construction, when we know how badly the office construction plan ended.
Yeah, and I think they would say, in fairness, that we want a certain vacancy rate. We want vacancy rates 5 and above. That's when you have a healthy market.
But here's the joke. The vacant offices in San Francisco are not lowering corporate rents in San Francisco. That's why they're still vacant. Nobody can afford them.
Correct. There's a similar history in any big city you care to name, particularly these superstar cities. That's really interesting to think about in San Francisco. In New York, there have been these kind of rezoning schemes and, planning to revalorize particular neighborhoods for many years, areas that were formerly industrial, places like Bushwick that I moved into when I was 18 in 2000, and there was a lot of warehouses there that could be turned into residential property and create more value over the coming decades. And actually they'd been planning that for quite a few years beforehand through zoning and tax abatement and all the rest. Anyway, there's a long history in doing this. YIMBY came along more lately as a kind of millennial movement to supercharge this and make it a political project, put it on the political agenda. And
we got to find jobs for those professional skateboarders who marry real estate developers.
Yeah, we can get them jobs at the YIMBY nonprofit.
That's Max Dubler for everyone who didn't realize who I was calling out.
Bless his heart.
I'm actually happy to be able to talk about this on the air for a while, because this is something that this is one that this is a topic that I have feelings about.
I do too, and to some extent, I knew about it in only at a distance.
Yeah,
and often through watching the discourse on a particular website, but it's something I started writing about because I think there are strong arguments against this way of planning.
Well, I mean, here in Portland, we did what they wanted as far as abolishing single zoning back in the 90s.
Yep.
And then they allegedly abolished single zoning here in the suburbs in 2018. Well, let me just say that we're not seeing massive rent drops.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll say I am not at all opposed to abolishing single-family zoning. I think that's a defensible position. I actually think upzoning and allowing private developers to build taller buildings is basically okay in most cases.
It varies. I have some issues with the places that YIMBYs seem to want to choose to build density.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, in the aftermath of the Pacific Palisades fires, we saw lots of California YIMBY groups advocating this huge, massive buildup of more residential homes in the place the fires just happened. You want to build density in the fire zone. Why?
Well, I think that's part of the problem, is that it's often very targeted where
where
they want to do upzoning.
What would it do to insurance rates to build density in the fire zone?
I know. I see people making posts like this where they're like, great, now it's time to start from scratch and build massive high-rises along the coast. Build high-rises in Malibu.
And some of the same questions come into mind when they talk about building high-rises in LA and San Francisco. Being as someone who comes from Southern California, my question is immediately, you say you want to build high rises in San Francisco and Los Angeles, but you also say you're against safety regulations. How do you feel about earthquake proofing? Because there's a reason it's highly regulated and somewhat expensive to build skyscrapers in San Francisco and Los Angeles, and it's called earthquakes.
Chris, earthquake proofing is red tape.
I understand that argument. I understand that argument, but now you see my concern.
Of course, yeah, and I think targeted upzoning in that way can create problems for neighborhoods. I think most YIMBYs would say that they advocate for broad-based, like a citywide upzoning, but it's not always politically possible. And for the most part, I don't argue with that. If you want to do that, okay. Or if as a city planning tool, you want to upzone in certain places to get more buildings there, sometimes okay. But I also understand why tenant organizers and longtime residents of like a low-income neighborhood might have concerns.
I'm not against upzoning in principle, but at the same time, the claims that the YIMBY movement makes about upzoning have not been borne out by the numbers in Portland. And so I am skeptical that it's any sort of solution.
That's what I'm getting to, is as an affordability solution. No, I'm sorry. That's not really what the data shows. And that's not what housing economists really believe either. The ones, at least, who I think are thoughtful about this. Broad-based upzoning, in my opinion, should come along with some rent regulations, because we have very little research on it, but the research we do have seems to show that when you upzone and build more high-end apartments, you might decrease rents somewhat in high-end apartments, but it can increase rents for low-end apartments. That's a problem. You're going to drive people out of the neighborhood. And you're going to push people out of their homes more concretely.
Yes.
And I think as a means to create affordability or lower rents, it's totally misguided. As we were saying before, now that we've like spelled out this project a little bit, no developer is going to tell you that they're going to build until rents fall. Developers build into a rising rent market, and developers stop building when rents start to come down. Austin, which the YIMBYs love to hold up as the YIMBY utopia, is a great example of that. There was a huge, once-in-a-generation historic building boom that actually started as rents were rising during the pandemic, before Austin did its huge upzoning. Developers started building. They built into a massive surplus, and now they're not building anymore. Rents came down. You know, that does actually work. It drove rents down. It wasn't necessarily because of YIMBY policy and upzoning. But yeah, more buildings brought rents down a bit. And now they're not building anymore, and you'll eventually see rents start to go up again. And rents are still in Austin far above where they were at pre-pandemic levels a few years ago. So I just don't think like the mechanism works. Well, that the examples, the case studies show that the mechanism works in the way.
There's a whole science of urban sociology as communicated by left-wing sociologists in Paris just in like the last 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years. That's so much more useful than anything that the YIMBYs appear to have come up with. Based on this whole concept of the social creation of space and every person in a city's right to that city. And I feel like I'm talking about something most people know nothing about, and yet at the same time, that these concepts of the right to the city are something that Americans should be talking about and aren't.
Yeah, I think that gets around, we're talking at a somewhat technical level, or how reporters are, or what the history is of YIMBYism. I don't think it's bad to build more buildings or build taller buildings, but the deal is,
the point is,
what are we building, and who is it for?
Who is building it? Who is it being built for? Who is benefiting from it being built?
And from my perspective, trying to do zoning and regulatory tweaks to try to coerce or induce builders to build the kinds of apartments you want, largely for, like a rising, I don't know.
Wouldn't it be easier? Wouldn't it be easier to just directly regulate the kinds of things you want people to build than to deregulate to incentivize it?
Or wouldn't it be easier to build it publicly through public investment? If you want a certain kind of housing to serve the people who are struggling in a city, with housing they can afford, that's high quality, that's a great idea. We should build it. And when I say we, I don't mean Equity Residential.
Yeah. Well,
I mean the public. We can invest in this kind of housing public.
This raises the next thing where you hear many YIMBYs, or at least you used to, talk all the time about land value taxes in order to use taxation to force density. Right. Now, I'm going to go off into the weeds. I hope people Google this a little bit, because I do want people who are listening to me to learn something every now and then. But the idea of a land value tax is based on a sort of British socialist principle called Georgism, which is the idea that society owns land and not landlords, and that the city or the state should be the only landlord. And yet, obviously, the people who are talking about a land value tax in the context of YIMBYism are not talking about the state being the sole landlord, which is just a little confusing.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, would that it were so that the state was the landlord.
We were very close to that at one point in our history about the state being the landlord. So close to it, in fact, that Howard Schultz grew up in a housing project. Back in the day when it was relatively normal for white middle-class Americans in New York to live in housing projects.
That's right.
And we don't have those anymore in the same way we had them for Howard Schultz's family. And Howard Schultz is rich now, so does the fact that he had these advantages have anything to do with the fact that he was able to be successful?
The public subsidized his success.
Yes.
As is the case for most of us, you know, through public education.
Yes.
Or for those of us not me, who've built wealth through home ownership, but certainly, you know, my parents and I've directly benefited as a result.
Yes.
We benefited because we publicly subsidize mortgages. We publicly subsidize home ownership. So, you know, it's a system that can work, public ownership, public landlording, but because of conservative ideology, libertarian ideology, we've kneecapped that system and made it impossible to even imagine a world where we can house people. We, as you know, the public sector can house people in a high quality place with adequate funding, with good maintenance, and really support them. But there is a past where we tried to do that. And there are other examples all across the developed world where countries have done that and supported their citizens. For a lot of reasons, we don't do that. But
Italy passed an urban homesteading law that allows you to just basically go if there's an empty residential building with empty apartments, the urban homesteading law in Italy basically says you can go squat in it if you stay there so long. That's your place, your apartment.
Yeah.
I oversimplify a little, but I mean, these are things that happen in other places, and we're not even talking about violently left-wing countries. We're talking about normal, limited, mocked by people like me, European social democracies who are able to do these things.
Yeah, a better world is possible.
And we just get into and instead we get all these deregulatory arguments.
Yeah, so that's what I say. That's what I've written. It's not clear to me why we're trying to cajole the private sector, profit-seeking actors, who so often are themselves abusive property owners in many ways, into creating the housing that we want, and especially housing for people who are at the bottom of the social ladder, when we could do this ourselves. If housing is so important, why wouldn't we just do it ourselves and properly fund it?
If housing is so important, why don't we guarantee everybody a home? I mean, remember how absolutely ridiculously controversial the idea of housing for all was in 2020.
Yeah.
Why don't we just say, you know, people have a right to a home? A home is a necessity in a modern society. We no longer have the kind of commons that we used to, where people could just live wherever they chose to build a house. People need places to live. It's society's responsibility to make sure everybody has a place to live. I
agree. And that's why I write about what I write about. in a lot of ways, when I do something like I do for the American Prospect, I'm reporting, and I'm reporting from a certain perspective, but it's not just to expose the bad actor of this corporate landlord or these few real estate investment trusts. It's to say our system relies on these actors to give us this basic need. Everybody needs housing. Many people rent. The poorest people among us rent. And we're relying on these actors, this type of actor that's so often abusive to the poorest people, to provide them housing. And we don't have to. There's an alternative. So that's, my propaganda project in reporting on the kinds of things I do, but also because I think we have a moral obligation to house people in a better way than we do, without saddling them with massive amounts of debt, without, even if they're living there and getting by, saddling them with all kinds of problems in their apartments that come from cost cutting. I think we can do this in a better way as a society. And we have, certainly, as you talk about often, we have the wealth in this society to do this in a much, much better way than we do. It's completely a matter of political will and political priorities. But profiteers aren't going to make that system happen. We have to do it by organizing as, the people, the 99%, the people who are not the wealthiest. And we have to demand it.
I have to agree completely. I really want to thank you for joining me. I appreciate it very much. Do you have any final thoughts or plugs before I wrap us up?
No, I just really appreciate you having me on the show. This has been a great conversation, and it's been great getting to know you online, and very nice to have a full conversation about all these interests.
It's totally my pleasure, and I hope you go first.
Yeah, nothing to plug except please go read my article at the American Prospect about this rent debt strike and about the corporate landlords' racist eviction practices that I wrote in May. And you can find me on all the platforms at MFRIEDRICHNYC. We can connect there.
And I want to thank you for joining me today, Michael. I really appreciate it. I am going to ask you again, please keep me informed of anything you want me to read that we could be talking about again. I think these kind of conversations are more important on a Sunday morning than some of what people are going to get on cable news or NBC or CBS right now. So I really appreciate you being here to have it with me. For everybody else, I want to remind you that John Maynard Keynes said that capitalism is when the worst of people do the worst of things for the worst of reasons and tell themselves it's for everybody's good.
A great quote. Thanks so much.
On that note,
Sunday morning with you, Chris.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you, Michael. And on that note, folks, I hope to see everybody next week. And until then, we'll tweet at you.